Welcome to the Discover Alaska Lecture Series, brought to you by the University of Alaska's Summer Sessions and Lifelong Learning. My name is Althea St. Martin, and I'll be your host for this summer series. Summer Sessions again has a full lineup of free programs Monday through Thursday evenings at 7 p.m. Discover Alaska is in its 16th season, and this year the majority of the programs will be held here in the BP Design Theater, which is located in our new engineering building on the UAF campus. It is also live streamed and recorded. This allows us to take advantage of technology to present to a much wider audience. We really appreciate the time our speakers donate to help us all learn more about our great state. But before I introduce tonight's speaker, a few housekeeping items. You can share and view all of the Summer Sessions series online later by going to UAF Summer Sessions website. And that's at uaf.edu/summer/events. Tonight, in addition to questions from our in-person audience, our online viewers can type their questions for the presenter into the link at the bottom of their screen or the chat box. And also, UAF's mask policy is you do not need a mask if you are fully vaccinated. I'm truly delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Robbie Herrick, a researcher at the Geophysical Institute who is on the NASA team for the recently announced Venus mission. His topic, when did Earth's sister break bad? NASA's upcoming Venus missions. Robbie received his PhD in geophysics from the Southern Methodist University. His graduate work used data from NASA's two previous missions, Pioneer Venus and Magellan. He was a staff scientist at the Lunar and Planetary Institute in Houston. He has been a research professor at the Geophysical Institute since 2004. He is a co-investigator on the NASA Veritas mission to Venus, which will be launched in 2028. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Robbie Herrick. Robbie.
Thank you, and let me make sure I got all this working here. Okay, so what I hope to do tonight is, I'm sure many of you are not at all familiar with the planet Venus, so I want to introduce you to the planet Venus and tell you a little bit about what we know about the planet Venus and why, hopefully, I will convince you that it is a very interesting place to think about and worth sending spacecraft to. And then I want to introduce you to the three missions that have been selected within the past month to fly to Venus in the coming decade. All right, so on the lower left of the title slide here, you'll see a couple of globes. The one on the left is pretty much how Venus looks if you were to look at it through a telescope or fly in person to Venus. It's essentially a featureless yellow ball. And the reason for that is that there is a very dense atmosphere, and in the cloud deck are a bunch of sulfur compounds that color the atmosphere yellow and prevent you from seeing the surface. A lot of times you'll also see Venus rendered as the image to the right, that orangey looking thing, and what you're looking at there is the atmosphere stripped away and the surface as imaged using synthetic aperture radar. So radar can see through the clouds, and for the purpose of this talk, synthetic aperture radar is a technique that basically allows you to get an overhead black and white image of the surface. This has been false colored to give it that orangey appearance. I'll tell you why in a second, why this orangey color is used. And then what you see on the sort of the right side of the title slide here are CAD drawings of the three spacecraft that have been selected in the past month and that will fly to Venus in the coming decade. The top two are NASA-run missions, an orbiter, Veritas, and then a probe called Da Vinci. And then the bottom one is a European Space Agency mission called Envision that has contributions from NASA involved. And so, and I'm actually involved with the two orbiter missions, but not the probe mission. So let's talk about Venus. So most people tend to think of Mars as being the most Earth-like planet in the solar system, in part because of images like that on the bottom left there. You can see the Ingenuity drone on the surface of Mars. And the surface there looks quite a bit like some of the drier desert areas on Earth. And the surface temperature of Mars, the warmest places on Mars overlap with the coldest places on Earth. So that makes most people think of Mars as the most Earth-like planet. But really that resemblance is purely superficial. In terms of size, Venus and Earth are almost identical in size. Venus and Earth are very similar in distance from the sun, but the surface property of Venus that is most notable for a lot of people is this the line here with the surface temperature. Because Venus has a very dense carbon dioxide atmosphere, it acts as a greenhouse, and the surface temperature on Venus is 850 Fahrenheit. And the surface pressure is 90 times Earth's atmosphere, so roughly the pressure you'd feel about a kilometer deep in Earth's oceans. So NASA has never had a Venus lander. The former Soviet Union had a handful of landers, and on the bottom right here you can see that none of their so because of the hot surface temperature, no lander so far has lasted more than a couple of hours, but that was long enough for some of these landers to take pictures. Because of the filtering by that yellowish atmosphere, the surface, if you were standing on it, is probably sort of orangey, which is why that previous globe had an orangey color added to it. If you took away the atmosphere, though, the rocks on the surface of Venus would at least where these landers landed, would be kind of a dark gray to black, pretty much like the rocks that you would find in the Hawaiian Islands, basalts. Anyway, the point I want you to take away from this is that Mars is superficially like Earth, but really the true sibling of Earth is Venus, and because it is similar in size. And why does the similarity in size matter? So in terms of the similarity in size, what that means is that Venus is going to be, in terms of its geologic diversity and geologic activity, it's going to be much more Earth-like than the other smaller rocky planets in the solar system. And the reason for that is essentially the same reason that a large pot of stew will stay hot longer than a cup of soup. And basically, so most of what we think of in terms of geologic activity, like volcanoes and earthquakes and mountain building, is really all driven by when the planets form, they are much hotter than outer space. And so they're, over long time scales, they're sort of like a pot of boiling water. And the only ability for a hot planet to cool off is at the surface, either conducting stuff through the surface or even more efficiently, bringing hot material up to the surface, and that helps the planet cool off. And so the amount of hot material is dictated by the volume of the planet, and the ability to cool off is dictated by the surface area of the planet. So it can only cool off through the surface. So if you double a planet's diameter, you're going to increase the volume 8 times, but you're only going to increase the surface area 4 times. And so that means that the larger your planet is, the more it's going to be hot and geologically active. And so this is basically the reason that the Earth, even if we stripped away the oceans and the atmosphere, and would still be a pretty happening, dynamic place. We'd have the plates moving around, we'd have those mid-ocean ridges, we'd have the volcanoes in Hawaii and other places. But the moon, which is more or less made of the same stuff as Earth and formed at about the same time, has not really changed in the last billion years or so. So if you went back in time 1 billion years, Earth would look quite different, the moon would look almost the same. And if you look at the moon, of course, what it is covered with is these things called impact craters. And so if nothing is happening on the surface of a planet, this debris left over from forming the solar system, which we call asteroids and comets, just continually flying around every now and again. Some of that debris hits all the bodies in the solar system and forms craters. So if nothing's happening on the surface, it just builds up craters. So when you look, and so what this means is you can use craters and the number of craters to kind of get an idea for the surface age of a planet based on the planets being continually struck by stuff. So when you look at the moon, the other thing I want to point out here, if you look at the moon, there's some dark areas on the moon that seem to have fewer craters. And what those are, the lunar maria, represent roughly 1 billion years into the moon's history. There was a brief period where there was volcanism that poured out on the surface, about 15% of the surface, and filled in the low-lying areas. And so those areas are younger than the rest of the moon. So the fact that the Earth and Venus are roughly the same size means that we're expecting that Venus should still be very active in terms of its volcanism and tectonics. And so the last mission that the last mission that NASA sent to Venus was called the Magellan mission, and it had as I said, it had a synthetic aperture radar that was used to take what essentially are overhead black and white photos of the surface. And this is a global map that came out of that mission. And what you can see, even at this global scale, is that Venus does not look anything like the moon. It's not covered with craters. It is, in fact, geologically, in terms of its overall surface age, it's comparable to the Earth in terms of just being quite young. It's much younger than the surface of Mars or Mercury or the moon. But if you look at this, you do not see, what you don't see are things like a nice set of organized spreading ridges like we have on Earth, and you don't see places where things that you would call continents fit together but are separated. So at this scale, we don't see an organized system of plate tectonics like on Earth. But if we zoom in a little, we certainly see plenty of volcanoes on the surface of Venus. There are thousands of them at all different scales. The one on the, and some of them look quite a lot like Earth volcanoes. Some of them sort of look like funhouse mirror versions of Earth's volcanoes. And so this one on the upper left is, you can see quite a resemblance to of that volcano to something like the Hawaiian volcanoes. But These ones down here in the center, these are nicknamed pancake domes. They're tens of kilometers across and obviously look sort of like pancakes. These have some analogs on Earth. One of the most prominent analogs is the Nova Rupta structure, which some of you may be familiar with in the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. The difference is the Nova Rupta structure is only a couple of kilometers across, whereas these things are more like 30 or 40 kilometers across. So there's plenty of volcanoes on Venus. And these volcanoes, if you zoom out, this is an area about the size of Asia. You can see what's going from diagonally from bottom left to upper right is a gigantic rift system that has some resemblance to, say, the East African rift system. And then you can see so the things labeled Mott, Aza, and there's one covered by the zoom thing up in the very top called Sapis Mons, which some of you online can probably see. But these are big volcanoes with flows that extend hundreds of kilometers across the surface. So the idea of having a rift zone with volcanoes on it is a familiar thing that happens on Earth. And then also on Venus, there is plenty of evidence of horizontal movement of the surface. And so this is an area called Alpha on Venus. We're going to return to this area a few times. So this is an area about the size of Australia. And if you look at this area and you see all of this sort of wormy, wavy lines going across this entire area, those are all folded faults and folding on Alpha. And so this is a sort of a continent-sized area that is heavily deformed. And so this is something you do not see on what we would call one-plate planets like Mars or Mercury or the Moon. So on Venus, we have evidence of movement of the surface. However, we don't have an organized system of plate tectonics. Now, the movement that we see on Venus is so far what we've identified is more on the order of tens to maybe a few hundred kilometers of movement, whereas on Earth, of course, we see thousands of kilometers of movement, like the separation of Africa and South America by the Mid-Atlantic Spreading Ridge, for instance. So one of the big surprises that came out of the Magellan mission was this plot. So this, what you're looking at here is a plot of when we were mapping the planet with Magellan. One of the things I did as a grad student was anytime as the images came in, if we saw an impact crater, we'd put its location and size down. And at the end of the mission, you can plot up the locations of all these impact craters. And the distribution that you see here, if you see a pattern, then it's kind of in your imagination, because statistically, this pattern cannot be distinguished from a random pattern. So to go back to my earlier slide there, where I talked about how if nothing happens, a planet will just accumulate craters, and craters can be used to separate young areas from old areas. This was a big surprise to have a pattern that shows up random. And so how do you get a random pattern? There's sort of two end ideas that you can use to kind of get this pattern, and maybe it's some mix of them. But one idea is that the planet is highly geologically active, and then in a fairly short period of time kind of shuts off and dies, and then nothing happens afterwards except for craters hitting the planet. And so that's how you get this random pattern. Another idea is that that everywhere on the surface, craters are getting wiped out at the same rate after they form, but maybe the processes that are getting the crater, that are wiping out the craters, are different as you go from place to place. And so if you think that neither one of those in-member ideas is really how a planet should behave, you are not alone. This is a big, perplexing mystery about Venus that we have not solved. And so the two sort of big, what I would say, conundrums that came out of the Magellan mission is that the distribution of craters across the surface is random, but the distribution of geologic features in terms of the volcanoes and the rifts and these deformed areas, which are called tessera, if you see that in some of the is not random. So how that occurs is a mystery. And the other kind of thing that we don't fully understand is that there's evidence of the surface moving around and crunching up to make mountain ranges and faults and folds, but we don't have plate tectonics, at least now on the surface, driving that process. So there have been a lot of kind of big picture ideas that have been put forth in terms of what's going on in the interior and how it's driving things on the surface to try and explain these two conundrums. And the previous mission, Magellan, showed us a lot about the planet, but to sort out these big picture ideas, basically we need more data. So the Magellan mission was able to image the surface at a resolution of a couple hundred meters. So that means, the smallest thing that you could see, a single, a football field across would be 1 pixel in an image. And so from that, you're not able to see some of the key things like individual lava flows or some of the key geologic contacts and borders between interesting features on the planet in order to sort out the overall sequence of events of when things formed and how, in order to distinguish between some of these big picture ideas. So that's why we need some new missions. But so in terms of a broader picture here, right now we have sort of two ways that planets work. All right, one is the way that Mars, Mercury, and the Moon work, which is what we would call a single plate planet, where the planet forms and then you get a crust that forms on the top, and that crust is pretty much fixed, and occasionally from heat things poke through and you get some volcanism. On Mars, things poke up enough that you get some cracking, and on Mercury, there's actually some cooling that has caused some shriveling features, but more or less the surface is fixed and doesn't move. And so that's a single plate planet. And then on Earth and on the icy shell of Europa, which is one of Jupiter's moon, you have plates on the surface. You have a set of rigid plates that are moving relative to each other and more or less operating somewhat independently of what's going on in the interior. And these plates move around, and in places they're spreading apart, and in other places they're doing what's called subduction and going into the interior. And so Venus, some of these big picture ideas for Venus, some of them involve either going from plate tectonics to a single fixed plate. Other ideas have Venus cycling between plate tectonics and a fixed plate. And then there's some other ideas that it could be that Venus is a completely different way that planets operate. Maybe instead of having plate tectonics, you have sort of a gooey surface that's moving around. This picture on the right is from a paper that came out just a week ago. It's an idea that's been floating around for a few years, and what you see here is they make a good case that Venus has, the analogy they draw is to pack ice, that there are little plates that are hundreds to maybe a few thousand kilometers around across that never subduct and don't spread far away, but jostle around and move tens to hundreds of kilometers. And that might be part of the explanation. So this is one of the reasons that I'm convincing you that Venus is a very interesting place to study, to move out a little bit in terms of big picture ideas. Is some of these ideas, and this is where sort of the break bad analogy comes into play. Some of the ideas have Venus being habitable, having a more Earth-like planet well into the history of the solar system. So if maybe 10, 20 years ago, most people thought, well, Venus pretty rapidly went from active to dead, but now there's some ideas that maybe it's lasted quite a long time. And where some of this, what's driving some of that thought is, this is Alpha again. While NASA's last mission was more than 3 decades ago, the Europeans and the Japanese have had missions to Venus in the past couple of decades, and there's also been Earth-based observations. And some of those missions had a camera that operated in the near infrared, so sort of in the range of night vision goggles, and that is able to, it's sort of like looking through frosted glass. You get a very fuzzy image of the surface, but you do see stuff on the surface, and there are hints that there are areas of the surface with essentially light rocks. And this is really a introductory geology type of thing, basically a light rock versus a dark rock. And so the light rocks are thought to be more like granite. And so it turns out on Earth, in order to produce these lighter rocks, which have more silica in them, that it's very difficult to produce a lot of them without having water involved and having the ability to take water and shove it into the interior and lower the melting point so you can remelt some of the dark rocks and make them lighter. So there are hints, and once again, the data is good enough to suggest something but not really establish it. But there are hints that there might be areas on Venus that are more felsic, more like granite, and that would require that water have hung around on the surface for a very long time, and it would require a climate then that is much more Earth-like, because currently, of course, at 850 degrees Fahrenheit, there is no water on the surface. So there are these ideas that Venus might have been habitable well into its history. So to go outward even more in terms of big picture ideas, over the last decade or last couple of decades, there's been these missions that have found thousands and thousands of planets orbiting other stars in our in our relatively nearby galactic neighborhood. And in terms of, and this is just a small subset of these planets, and so in terms of these types of graphs, Venus and Earth almost plot on top of each other, so the V and the E there. You'll notice, by the way, that in terms of like size versus how far away from the stars we are, they're still not quite to the ability to detect a true Earth-like solar system, although they're getting close. But so you'll see a lot of the press for some of these missions will describe Venus as the exoplanet next door. And so kind of the idea here is that to help figure out the odds that something that is Earth size and an Earth neighborhood around another solar system, what are the odds that it will actually be Earth-like? We want to understand how Venus and Earth started out so similar and yet ended up so different today. And so these are the motivators for the new missions that are coming up. And let me just briefly, as I said, there are 3 missions coming up. I am going to refer to them by their acronyms because the first 2 there have these tortured names that not even the team members can remember to come up with the mission name. So Veritas is Latin for truth, so we're going to find out the truth about Venus. And then Da Vinci, of course, is an acronym for Leonardo da Vinci. Envision, mercifully, does not have an acronym. The V is capitalized for Venus. And these are going to, at least currently, they're scheduled to launch in a sequence. Basically, the launch dates for going to Venus are dictated by every roughly 19 months, Venus and Earth make their closest approach in orbit. And so you launch about 5 months before that in order to get to Venus with the least amount of fuel. And I should say that things are still getting sorted out. All 3 of these missions were, the 2 NASA ones were actually proposed to launch, both of them to launch in 2026. But I guess budgetary constraints, they're launching in the next sequence of launch opportunities. Each of these 3 missions were proposed not knowing whether the other 2 would fly. And so the 3 missions have had some components that sort of overlapped with the other 2 missions. And so things are still being, obviously now that all 3 missions have been selected, there will be some process where things that are redundant will, instruments that are doing the same type of thing will be taken off of one of the missions. And the Veritas mission is going to go first so that it can do a little bit of scouting for the Da Vinci mission, which is a probe. And will use the Veritas results in part to help hone in on where it's going to go. So anyway, let me introduce these missions. I've got a few videos. There are some promotional videos that we'll put together. Some of them, you'll see. So let me start with the first one, which introduces both of the NASA missions. And go ahead. So, of course, it was it's kind of nice graphics, almost content-free, though, in terms of what the missions are about. But so let me tell you a little bit about each of these missions. So, first, I'm going to talk about the Veritas mission. It's the one that I'm on the science team for. There's basically two instruments on the Veritas mission. One is a synthetic aperture radar, and this one it's called an interferometric synthetic aperture radar. I'll talk about what that actually means here in a second. And then the second instrument on here is called the Venus emissivity mapper, which is essentially a multiband camera. Just to point out, as you're looking at this, if you're looking at the drawing here of the spacecraft on the right-hand side here, the alternating black and white bands that you see, the biggest thing on here, those are the solar panels, and then the kind of almost square truss thing on the bottom there, that is the interferometric synthetic aperture radar, and the two wide sides of that square are two radar panels. And then right in the center of that square, you can see what is really the bottom of the spacecraft bus, and there's a little circle there, and that is where the camera here, this Venus emissivity mapper, is sticking out. And so those two instruments will be working simultaneously from a low orbit around the surface of Venus. And a little bit about how this will work. So Venus very slowly rotates. So a sidereal day, which is the amount of time that the planet takes to rotate once on its axis, is 243 Earth days. And so to get a map of the planet, so unlike on Earth, where you can you put a spacecraft in a polar orbit and the Earth is spinning rapidly underneath you, you can it's kind of a complicated logistical exercise to set that up with the timing so that you map all of Earth, and you will see things like Landsats set up with the timing so that they pass over the same place every couple weeks. On Venus, because it slowly rotates, you just put this thing in an orbit, and as the planet slowly rotates under your spacecraft, you build up a 10-kilometer wide swath, and you just keep adding 10 kilometers until you have mapped the whole planet. And then you end up passing over the same spot the same way with your spacecraft once every 8 months. The Viser instrument can do two things. It can get images, which are, like I said, more or less like black and white overhead images, and then operating as an interferometric SAR, it can get very good topography. And so Viser does imaging and topography with an emphasis on getting topography. And the simplest way to describe it's a little complicated to describe how interferometry works, but what is taking place. This is very similar to the shuttle radar topography mapping mission, which operated a couple of decades ago. And the idea is you transmit from one radar and you receive an image in two radars that are separated by a very small amount, and that creates an interference pattern in some ways similar to the interference pattern you might have got when if you were like me, you took high school physics and you had a a ripple tank and you pulsed it and you got constructive and destructive interference out of that. And so the way this works with these images is that you get this interference pattern and the topography distorts the interference pattern, and that allows you to back out the shape very precisely of the planet. So you get images of the planet and you get topography, and this illustrates the improvement of the topography from the Magellan mission to the Veritas mission here. And there's the catchphrase there. And then the other thing that will be operating is this multi-band camera. And so it's going to, basically, as I mentioned, it's going to be using these infrared windows that can see the surface, but sort of through frosted glass. And it will get some basic compositional information about the surface. So the main thing it'll be able to figure out is whether there are areas with these sort of lighter felsic rocks or not, confirm or not confirm that hinted at observation, which would be a big deal in terms of requiring water on the surface for a long time. The other thing it'll do is it'll also be able to find unweathered versus weathered large areas, and so it'll help with figuring out the age of things. So the overall, the Veritas mission is geared towards using the tools of imaging and topography to figure out the sequence of events on the overall history of the surface features in order to sort out, because all these different ideas that I talked about with geodynamic scenarios have different accountings for the sequence of different features on the surface forming. All right, so the next mission after that is going to be the Da Vinci mission, which is a probe. And before I start the video here, I'll say that to know the personalities of the people involved, the Da Vinci mission is led by a guy who has a certain flair for showmanship. So I think this one's one of the more interesting videos.
On the hottest planet in the solar system, a probe descends through a thick, poisonous atmosphere. It is both a time capsule and time machine, unlocking secrets of the ancient past, while revealing how a world can turn from possibly habitable to horrible. The location? Venus. Our sister planet has much to tell us about our own and exoplanets, helping ignite a scientific renaissance for our universe. The mission, brought to you by NASA Goddard and its partners, is aptly named Da Vinci Plus, the first U.S. probe mission to Venus in over 40 years. With the probe acting as chemistry lab and photographer, other cameras will map and gather additional views of the planet from above, providing a new study of Venus that has scientific implications well beyond our own solar system. Da Vinci Plus will give us a new understanding of planetary evolution. Launching in 2029, 3 years will be spent exploring our celestial neighbor. Da Vinci Plus, coming soon to a planet near you.
Yeah. So one thing that I talked earlier about how these missions are still sorting out. So this mission was, you notice that they referred to it as Da Vinci Plus, okay? The plus part of that mission was a camera that was going to go into orbit that, and essentially that camera more or less is redundant with the Venus emissivity mapper on the Veritas mission. And so they canceled that part of the Da Vinci mission, so it's no longer Da Vinci Plus, it's just Da Vinci, which is, and so there will not be an orbiting part of the Da Vinci mission. So anyway, like I said, things are still being sorted out. it's no longer Da Vinci Plus, it's just Da Vinci. And it's going to it takes a little bit longer to get there in order to get, there's a carrier spacecraft, and then most of the meat of the mission, though, is a probe that is going to descend through the atmosphere over a time period of an hour or so. And so I'm not on this mission, and atmospheric science is not my specialty, but I'll give you a little bit of an overview of this. This really has sort of two key components to the probe. The first part is it's going downward. There's a set of instruments that are really designed to kind of get some of the details of the atmospheric composition and also kind of the physical state of the atmosphere in terms of temperature and pressure and things like that as the probe is descending. In particular, they're most interested in getting data, the data from the much earlier missions that were flown by the Russians and in the U.S. with Pioneer Venus was the last probe that the U.S. sent, which was actually a series of probes, but that was in sort of the early 80s, around 82 or 83. So the data that we have for the bottommost part of the atmosphere is particularly bad. So they'll be focusing on getting this chemical information is really designed. I think probably the key here is if we understand the history of the planet, the chemistry in the atmosphere tells you a little bit more about what happened, but also helps you figure out the processes that happened, particularly in terms of the interaction between the surface and the atmosphere and leading up to the when and the why of how you end up with this toxic, dense atmosphere on the surface. The other component of this mission that's interesting is as it gets close to the surface, there's a camera that's going to be looking down at the surface and imaging what it sees beneath it. And this will be the first probe that will go down on top of one of these heavily deformed regions. So this is going to the alpha region that I've already shown a couple of times. And because the atmosphere is so dense, at the surface, the atmosphere is about 16% of the density of the water. So as this thing goes down, it's actually falling relatively slowly, and it's going to hit the surface at probably, 30, 40 miles an hour. And so the odds are pretty good that even though this is designed as a probe, it's going to come down and it's probably going to survive impact, and it'll be able, if the cameras are pointing, it'll be able to take some pictures probably from the surface before it's not designed though to last more than a few minutes in those temperatures. But so any of you that follow, if you really follow space stuff, the Cassini mission had a Huygens probe that did a similar thing. It went into the largest moon of Saturn, and it went through, and even though it wasn't designed to be a lander, it lasted long enough after it hit the surface to take some pictures of the surface of Titan. So that's the Da Vinci mission. And then finally, the European Space Agency has a mission that is currently scheduled to launch in 2031. It will be an orbiter mission, and this is the movie for this one. It's pretty short. So they went with all art and no text. So I don't know. So anyway, whoops, let me go. All right. So this mission, like I said, all of these missions were sort of proposed independently. So this one also has a synthetic aperture radar on it. The emphasis of this radar, it operates at a different band, and with the Veritas radar, its emphasis is collecting the highest quality topography, and the imaging is good. This one is sort of the opposite way. It can do topography, but its emphasis is on the imaging, and so it will be able to get a little bit higher resolution imaging. It will operate at a little bit at a longer band, longer wavelength than the other one, and because of that, the end result is that it will get better resolution. It will also get sort of better, I don't know how to describe this in layman's terms. I say better crispness of the images, and it will have a capability for polarimetry, which essentially will help make it easier. The images that come out will make it easier to separate different types of lava flows based on kind of get into the details of radar, but based on it'll be able to tell better at telling rough lava flows from smooth lava flows, and little differences in textures that'll make it easier to sort of sort out individual lava flows from an overhead image. So. And then in addition, what you see here are the flags are the countries that are contributing instruments. So the VinSpec-M, that is a camera that is almost identical to the Venus emissivity mapper. That is, in fact, the guy running that is the same person on both missions. So I'm not sure if they'll make modifications to that camera now that they know both of these missions are going to fly. The other two ones labeled VinSpec are different. The one that has the U is operating in the ultraviolet, and the one that's labeled H is operating in a different part of the infrared, but has more spectral resolution and less spatial resolution, and basically those two instruments are geared towards getting information about the lower atmosphere and the upper atmosphere and figuring out some of that. The other instrument, the SRS here, is a radar sounder, and so that uses very long wavelength radar and sort of points down, and if all goes well, you get a little cross section into the subsurface up to a few hundred meters, so that you can see at least how some of the contacts go into the surface, and maybe see layering in some of the lava flows. And so this instrument, and by the way, this mission, the other two missions are about $500 million plus a launch vehicle in terms of cost, which puts them on the low end of interplanetary missions. So, for instance, the Mars rover that landed this year is in the more like in the couple $1 billion range. So, and then this European mission has a few more instruments because it's sort of about more like $750 million. So it's got a little bit more budget compared to Veritas, which is why it's got a few more instruments on it. So, anyway, those are the three missions coming up in the next decade. And I guess I should have mentioned that each one of them will operate for the prime mission is operating at the two orbiters will operate at Venus for 2 to 3 years, but hopefully the way these things work, you propose for a short mission, but you hope everything works and they could operate for a few times that duration at least. Of course, a probe is a probe, so it's going to go down and that's it. So, all right, and that's, I'm going to stop there and take questions. So.
All right, well, first off, we've got a question from one of our online viewers.
Okay.
And they want to know, how does Venus compare to Earth in relation to magnetic field and auroral activity?
Okay, so out of my field, but I will tell you that, Venus does not have an internal dynamo, or so it does not have an active magnetic field. I don't think we have firmly established exactly why that is, but I think the idea is that because it's such a slow rotator, that has something to do with why Venus does not have an active dynamo. It could be, there's also the interior interaction of the, we know nothing about the core, other than Venus and Earth are more or less the same size and mass, so we think the basic divisions on the inside are going to be similar. But part of what drives Earth's magnetic field is the interaction between the inner core, the outer core, and the mantle above, and how material works on that, and a topic that's still being worked out. So to go backwards though, Venus does not currently have a magnetic field, however, which means that the solar wind comes in and is much more directly interacting with the planet. And there are at least sometimes, and this is out of my field, but you can find in the literature, there's sometimes when the solar wind interaction comes around and blasts into the upper atmosphere on the night side of Venus, and you get something that you could sort of call auroral activity. You get some oxygen glow there, but it's very different from what we would call auroras on Earth. But there is some hints of auroral activity on Venus.
Thank you. How about questions from our live audience here? Does someone have any questions? Okay.
Does Venus have any internal source of heat? In the Earth, I understand, there's radioactivity, which maintains the convection and so on. Is anything comparable to that been detected on Venus?
Okay, so as far as we know, all right, because Venus, as far as everything we know about how the solar system formed, indicates that Venus should have started off with a comparable amount of radioactive material, and so. And so the simplified version that I presented of how things cool is distorted when you have your own heat source. So all of these things, I gave a simple story, but the basic physics applies that the smaller planets cool off quicker, but that's modulated in terms of how that happens by the fact that all of the planets start out probably with a relatively similar amount of radioactive materials. And so Venus, as far as we can tell, started out that way. The Soviet landers had some basic geochemistry stuff that was able to, which I can't recall exactly which instruments they have, but basically detected radioactive materials in the abundance that you would expect to be consistent with basalts on Earth. more or less, different types of basalt. So as far as we can tell, Venus should have pretty much a similar level of driving radioactivity as Earth.
Right here.
Would you elaborate, please, a little on what your role in this is going to be?
Okay, I'll just talk about the Veritas mission. The Envision mission has had, it's a long story. The Envision mission has had many trials and tribulations before it got selected. So my role, I have a role of some sort which has not fully been sorted out yet. But for the Veritas mission, I have a couple of roles. One is it's a non-science role, but I will sort of be overseeing the process of taking the spacecraft data and getting it organized and in a form where it can be distributed to other researchers and in the public. And so that's sort of it's just a data gathering, organizing. You have to design a bunch of headers for all the images so you know where they are on the planet and other parameters. And then my science role is really going to be about, I talked about the impact craters, and one of the key things in using the impact craters to date the surface is to see how they are affected after they form by volcanism and tectonics. And so that's probably the area of scientific focus that I'll be involved with. So looking at, right now we can, so some of my previous research using Magellan data concluded that a lot of the impact craters had some lava flowing into them, which tells you that at least the idea that the planet completely died instantaneously is wrong. But there's more with the better topography and better imaging, we'll be able to figure out whether the lava that flowed in from the outside or whether there are small volcanoes in the interior, and exactly how much filling of the craters and how they're affected after they form, which will then feed into the overall sequence of events. So that's my main science role on the Veritas mission.
In your picture showing the craters, I was impressed about the uniformity of the size of the craters. And I thought, that was a little bit strange because, and the other thing too is we have a very dense atmosphere. And so the other thing I'm wondering about is the penetration of extra, Venus objects getting actually to the ground to make a crater.
All right, so you're catching me in all the things that I'm doing to simplify some of this, but yes, you're correct. So in general, the way things hit a planet, there's few large things and more smaller and smaller things. And so in terms of the diameter of craters, there's actually a large range from the largest crater on the planet is about 300 kilometers across. There's only a handful, maybe a few dozen that are more than 100 kilometers across. There's about 900 total craters on the planet, most of which are sort of in the 30 kilometers across. As you pointed out, there are, for a similar age of a Martian surface, there would be hundreds more craters. Well, in terms of the globe, there would be thousands more craters because on Venus, the dense atmosphere prevents craters smaller than, say, really about 2 or 3 kilometers in diameter from making it to the surface. And if you look at the distribution of sizes, there's really, the atmosphere is able to prevent things up to 20 or 30 kilometers from forming a crater unless it comes in at the right angle and it's a particularly sturdy material that's coming in. And then at the smaller diameters, there's lots of examples of things that have broken up and instead of forming a single circular crater, formed a field of craters or formed a really distorted crater where something like buckshot hit the surface. So that's another problem on Venus in terms of dating the surface is we're also hindered by this atmosphere really making it, producing fewer craters over time in order to be able to, on Mars you have enough craters that you can really break down, smaller areas in terms of their overall age. So that is a factor in terms of, just being able to, you have to use pretty large areas on Venus that are, at least, a non-random, the fact that the distribution is statistically random is important, but the small number of craters means that there could be a lot of non-randomness that we're missing simply because we have far fewer craters. And then on Earth, of course, so the other thing I didn't really mention is that because of the dense atmosphere at the surface and there's no water, erosion is not an important process as far as we can tell on Venus, whereas it is on Earth, of course. And so, even if we didn't have erosion on Earth, we'd have we'd have more craters on Earth simply because we have a less dense atmosphere, and they'd be distributed very differently. Because of erosion on Earth, we have a similar number of impact structures, but only a handful of them are not completely eroded into something that you can't really tell from orbit.
And one more question.
Are you sure that all the computer chips would not melt away?
I think it'll be okay. The probe only, the only one that matters, of course, is for the probe. Everything else we can control the temperature, but the probe is designed to last. It only has to last an hour, and it's got kind of a, like the Soviet ones. It's really just you put enough insulation on the ball that the stuff inside stays cool. It's a fairly that part is fairly understood. I don't think the electronics will be okay in terms of temperature. Now, whether the electronics malfunctions or not is a whole different thing. So, and unfortunately if you, with an orbiter, if something goes wrong, nowadays you do have effectively a personal computer on board. And so if you have a lot of problems you can fix simply by doing some programming after you get there. But with a probe, it's going to be operating autonomously, and there's no correcting things once it's going into the atmosphere. It either works or it doesn't. So, but I don't know. There's a lot of, I'm fairly confident that, there's a lot of testing now and things are pretty reliable. So I'm not too worried.
Well, we want to thank you for really giving us an in-depth view of our sister planet there. And we look forward to, in a couple of years, getting a lot more information on what your findings were. So let's give him a big round of applause. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thanks. Thanks for having me.